welcome, ladies and gentlemen, to another edition of the podcast. And before I get into my spiel, and this is, a new thing I've done for video, not like a new segment or anything of that. And there's no, by the way, no notes I'm looking at. I'm looking right at the camera, which I usually never do. I'm always usually looking at the screen, but now I'm looking into the camera, the face camera, whatever you want to call it, about this video. And I should have done this for the other ones and split up into two, so it gives me enough time to spread out episodes so I don't have to worry about getting a guest the week of a new episode. Anyways, what I want to talk about, and I sort of just alluded to that, is that this week's episode was a long one. I recorded an episode this week, 2 hours in length, the longest I've ever done. The man by the name of David Beard, who's the editor and sort of creative force and genius behind the Endless Summer Quarterly Beach Boys magazine for the last almost 30 years, to be honest. And it was such a great conversation. The first half of these videos is about uh, his life right now and sort of how he got into the Beach Boys and Jan and Dean music and the magazine. And the second half is sort of about the Beach Boys and his relationship with the band. And I don't want to say inner circle, but sort of that in a sense. And his opinion and viewpoint on stuff when Beach Boys news or updates come out, and he already knows about it, but can't really say it about it. His viewpoint on people's opinions on certain Beach Boys members. It was a long conversation, like I said. He was very insightful, inquisitive, poignant, or however you say it, and many other adjectives to describe what it's like from his perspective with the Beach Boys and his view on the band and his relationships with them, the inner circle, to sort of say. Although that might not necessarily be true, and that he may disagree with that, but whatever. But like I said, though, this was a very long episode, so stay tuned to this. I hope you all enjoy this weekend's or this past weekend's NFL, AFC, and NFC championship games. Depending on when you see this episode, you may see it Tuesday, so the weekend prior, or you may see it, who knows, in the future, weeks after the NFL season or months or years after it ended. But enjoy this part one, and part two will be next week on next Tuesday. So take care and enjoy this. From Wakefield, it's the Nolan Carr Night Show, star Nolan, where you join Nolan's guest this week, David Beard, to the program. And now, ladies and gentlemen, here's Nolan. And welcome back, ladies and gentlemen, to another edition of the show. And joining me this week is a pretty special and amazing person. Not only is he a fanatic fan of the frivolity that is all the fun of the Beach Boys, but he's also the host of Good Vibrations, a Beach Boys program. But he's also a producer, a songwriter, graphic artist, but also the creative genius for the last 29 years of Endless Summer Quarterly, the best source of musical reading material ever, I think. He is the one and only David Beard. David, how are you doing today?
I'm doing well. Thank you for having me on the show.
Of course. Well, as we were talking a few seconds ago about snow and the weather and all that fun jazz and the Beach Boys. Obviously, the last 2 years, as I like to sort of talk with all my guests, it's been an interesting time. Music has been on and off. Concerts, I'm sure. The Beach Boys, they've been on and off, but thankfully they're back. Brian's back touring, and he's got a big tour coming up, as well as the Beach Boys, and this is their big year. And you've been doing ESQ stuff during the pandemic, but how's life been for you these last hectic few years?
Well, it's been at times quite challenging. I I will disclose I've had a number of surgeries. In 2019, I had stage 4 neuroendocrine cancer. Fortunately for me, I did not have to go undergo chemotherapy. And then in November of 2020, during the pandemic, I had to have my spleen removed because I had a tumor
Oh,
that had grown attached to my stomach and spleen. So when they did that surgery, they had to remove my spleen. So it was, which resulted in me being in the hospital just twice this holiday season because I had a fever. So if I get a fever of above 100.4,
okay.
um, I have to go into the hospital. So it's a unique, it's a lot to digest and process because it is, generally speaking, for anybody out there, different times for all. And to have to adjust the way that I approach my life because of the surgeries that I've had makes it even more challenging. I'm talking to you and I'm looking
Yeah.
behind and seeing this array of mess. I'm like overheat. It's such you can tell. When I come, this is my office. So
Yeah.
when I come into work, I just kind of go to work and I kind of have blinders on all the stuff going on around me because I just come and I sit down and
Yeah.
this is where
Of
I do my
course.
podcast and I do the magazine. This
Yeah.
is right here. So
Well, I want to talk about the magazine
and how it's been the last bit of time. And obviously you've still released our editions, as I just mentioned before, going the one for Carl, what would have been his 75th birthday. But how much of the construction of the issues the last few years, how much has that changed since this all started?
Well, it really changed for me in 1999, because in 1999 we had when I started doing the magazine in August of 93 with Lee Dempsey. Lee was involved in writing. He was involved in the editorial. Um, and we had a good friend of ours, Greg Russell, doing the graphic design. Because I love music, but I wasn't really into the graphic design side of things. So I would go over and I would sit with Greg, and he worked in Quark Express, and I would study I would just pay attention to what he was doing and kind of direct, next to him and say, let's try this, let's do this. So I learned kind of inadvertently graphic design just from watching Greg for a number of years, because he was the guy who was putting together the magazine from 93 until I think 99. And slowly but surely, by that time I got Quark Express and I started to work in it. So by the time that Greg we transitioned to me, it just gave me more controls. Like, I guess I liken it to if somebody's the mixer in a recording studio,
Okay.
you don't want two mixers. It's better to just have one. And I look back at the stuff I started doing when I took over, and I think the magazine's come a long way from a graphic design standpoint and from a content standpoint, and the way that the content is presented. So I've been pleased with the value that I've been able to consistently bring to the fans in that respect.
The last 2 years during this whole pandemic, when you've been doing this, has it at any point been sort of hard for you to paint a picture of the story that you're telling when it's strictly just over the phone? Because I'm sure beforehand you were in person doing stuff, but what was that process like during this time?
Well, actually, most of the interviews I do are over the phone. When timing aligns, where they're on tour and they can sit with me, which has happened, where they can sit with me before a show or after a show. I mean, I had a great interview back in 2000 with Brian after a show. He was much younger then, as was I. I'll tell you a funny story about that in a second. And then, like, typically Mike will do his interviews before the show. If it's all set up and they understand, it's easier on the phone because, if they're going from, Mike actually prefers to do interviews while he's on tour on the phone. Because when you think about it, if you're sitting in a tour bus driving for hours from one location to another, what else is he doing?
Of course.
And so that I found that that's when he's most comfortable, is when he can just kind of shoot the breeze with me, talk about other things in life, and then we'll get down to the conversation at hand, which is about whichever topic I'm talking to him about. And in 2000, when I was backstage with Brian, I had been in radio for a number of years. That's what I did right out of high school. I went to a broadcasting school and then went right into radio. So one of the things I always like to do is voices, and some I'm better at than others. But one of the things I thought I would do if I got some time with Brian after the interview, as I would try to do my Paul McCartney impression, and I'll try to do it here. It's been a long time. You have to really stay in practice with things, but. So I was sitting next to Brian. Our interview ended. I have it on tape because the tape was still rolling. And I said, "Hey, Brian, before we go, I'd like to do my Paul McCartney impression for you." And he went, "Oh, really?" Kind of like, what does that even mean?
Yeah.
Because lots of people do Elvis Presley impressions, right? I don't do Elvis impressions. But he just had this like kind of suspicious look, like, what, huh? And so I just started and said, "So one day I woke up and there's a melody, going about in my head. And I went over to the piano and I played Scrambled Eggs. Oh, my darling, how I love your legs." And those were good legs. Those were. And he just goes, he had 3 responses. He goes, "That's messed up. That's unbelievable. that's pretty damn good. And he stood up and I hugged him and he left. And that was like my moment of, I, you know, I had this moment with Brian, and that of course never went into print. That wasn't something that had anything to do with the interview or anything, but it was just this neat little moment that I had with him. And it's those kind of things where, there's other things that wouldn't be fitting for this conversation, where I tell dirty jokes or whatever to the guys. That was one of the things I did, and I think it's because I came from radio that I immediately, when I started to get to know them, when I would meet them, because there's an initial thing, and I think this happens with fans and any celebrity or whatever it is that you get to meet. You go backstage or whatever it is, and you have maybe your first, oh, do you have a camera? I got to get a picture. And then there's I also got my Sharpie. I got my Sharpie here, and I got my album. I want them to sing, this is the, so you have all these things going on in your head that you're trying to it's so important that you get those things accomplished. And then once you do those things, and I've been privileged and honored to be able to do those things 1,000 times over, so much so that now with the magazine, I actually have extra stuff that's signed that I give away. And it's, you get past that point, and I thought, okay, well, if they're going to allow me into their lives, and they're going to give me their time and their energy, and they're going to talk to me about these things and let me deliver these stories in the magazine, then I'm going to kind of I just want to lighten the mood. I don't want this to be the usual interview. So I would always come in with a joke. I'd always have, and I don't know if they always heard the jokes, but they're usually something that was relevant to what was going on in the news cycle at that given time. So I'd have some sort of joke, and I'd come in before I'd start the interview. I would just, tell a joke just to kind of get their mind at ease, and that really kind of lent itself to becoming, I don't know, I wouldn't call it friends. Yeah, I've never becoming friendly. I always tell anybody, yes, I've known these guys for a very long time, but the idea of coming into their lives and becoming their friends is kind of a fool's errand to me. If you come into it just with no hidden agenda and just true purpose and value, knowing that if they're going to give you their time, then you're going to do your due diligence to execute the best way that you can to present who they are in written form. And it's not so much them just talking about an album or a song, but trying to also capture the essence of who they are as people and translating that onto the page.
I want to quickly ask, and I want to get on to sort of the beginning of your story. When you had done the impression for Brian, do you ever mention that to him nowadays, that of that moment to him, or is it something that was just so long ago that he couldn't remember?
I don't know that he'd recall, but a year later, I had him on the phone, and I did say, hey, I want to do another McCartney impression. And he said, okay, and so it's just, that one was not, I don't even know what it was I said. I just went into the voice, the voicing, and he cracked up, and then we talked about one of my favorite Beach Boys song. But but with each of them, they each have a very unique sense of humor.
I'm sure,
their own way. And again, if you can just make them happy for having spent their time with you, that's kind of I want them to feel rewarded because I feel rewarded.
You mentioned a few seconds ago that your job is to not necessarily be friends or close with them, but to sort of make them at ease when you're in their presence. Is there one that for you that's been, I don't want to say harder, but harder at when first meeting them, that was a challenge for you to get make them at ease, or were they just to some degree the same?
I think that the hardest one to kind of just have relax is Brian.
Sure.
Brian is just, and this is true with all of them. Everybody always wants something from them.
Definitely.
So, always, right? Whether it's they want them to perform on stage and they're showing up to a gig, whether they want an interview with them because they're releasing a new collection, a new song, whatever it is, or an autograph or a picture. Back in the 60s, it was probably a piece of their hair or their clothing. Yes. But, one, I just consider, I don't know if it's because I was in radio or not, but I just consider myself lucky that when I met them, um, I just immediately viewed them as human beings. I didn't, I felt that they were really cool and interesting people. Um, and that's how I've always thought of them. When I met the Moody Blues, that was different. They're actually my favorite group. And I was all kind of like Justin Hayward. I was just having him sign some albums for me, and I was just tongue tied. I don't even know what it was kind of like the I'm not worthy scene in Wayne's World.
Oh, sure, yeah.
That was that feeling. But then when I walked onto John Lodge, I thought, God, I don't want to stand there tongue tied like that. What do I say to John Lodge? Because it was like a few feet to walk to him with the records. So I said, hey, you guys worked with Brian Wilson, right? And then boom, it was this beautiful, relaxed conversation. So that was a learning lesson. And I think the biggest lesson I learned, and I'd already been doing the magazine for a few years, was the Beatles Anthology in '96. That was what taught me a big lesson, because I was watching it and I thought, my gosh, this interviewer isn't asking very difficult questions.
Definitely, yeah.
And I thought they're kind of softball, but there's a point where the interviewer asked Paul, George, and Ringo about the time they were at Elvis's house, and did they remember the color of Priscilla's dress? And I thought, why is he asking that?
Yeah.
And then they each have their answers, and then it comes to George. And George says, I don't remember the color of the dress. I was looking for Aoife. And I thought to myself, if the guy asking the questions, and I'm sure he had done his research, and I'm sure he knows that they were getting high there, had he said to George, is it true that you were looking for pot when you were at Elvis's house? What that does is it would put George on the defensive automatically. It would, even if George didn't mind the question, it would be kind of putting your thumb down on the interview subject. So you're automatically putting a thought into the person, as opposed to leaving it open-ended and allowing the person to reflect on the era of the question that you're asking about. And that was a big learning moment for me, to kind of not throw some sort of weird random thing about Priscilla's dress, but the way to approach asking somebody a question, and to leave it kind of them to let their minds explore what you're asking, so who knows what you'll get, right? And that may lead to something else that you weren't even thinking about asking them. So that was a telling moment for me.
And that definitely separates it, and I try my best to do that in this sort of situation, and maybe in your situation as well, where, these people, whether it's someone in the main group, whether it be the Beatles or the Beach Boys, or maybe the supporting cast that's played with them, they have hundreds of interviews, thousands, certain people, and they get asked a lot of the same stuff. So it's not as entertaining as if you asked that question about the dress color instead of the reefer or whatever it was. You mentioned the Moody Blues and the Beach Boys, and I know you're a fan of Jan Dean, but growing up in New York, how much of that music, Beach Boys and Jan Dean specifically, were around in your area, or was it totally something else that you had been listening to at that point?
It was something else, and it's the funniest thing too, because it took me years, decades, to realize how I got into the Beach Boys. And I mean, I can remember hearing Beach Boys songs on the radio. I don't really remember any Jan and Dean, and I don't know that I would have known the difference. Let's say Little Old Lady or Surf City would come on. I don't know that when I was at it, I would have even known. The thing that I was into, and a lot of my buddies were too, was Kiss.
Okay.
And I mean, I had a huge Peter Criss poster and a huge, I think Paul Stanley. It seems those were my favorite. And at the time, Destroyer came out in '76. I mean, that album, I just recently downloaded on iTunes the 45th anniversary of that album. It's just, that was a concept album to me. It starts, the radio turns on, you hear the keys turning, the car cranking up. It's very visual. And then the music starts and it carries you through the album. And I just, that visualization, and I became a major Kiss fan very quickly. We all were, all the kids I mean, I was Gene Simmons for Halloween one year.
Wow.
Not very, I didn't look very good, but you do what you do, you put the makeup on and then you go out. And, but we were all Kiss fans. And in 1978, Kiss Alive 2 came out.
Okay.
And it was 3 sides that were a live show. And then the 4th side of the record was these studio cuts that were either B-sides to singles or left off albums or whatever the rhyme or reason was. And one of the songs was Any Way You Want It. And Paul Stanley sings lead on it, but it's the Dave Clark 5 hit. But again, there was no Google in 1980, whatever. And I had no idea. I didn't care who the Dave Clark 5 were. I just loved that song. And I can remember going into junior high school and walking down the hallways and singing Any Way You Want It. And that was my introduction to oldies music. That song by Kiss was one of the most, was as significant in my memory as being one of the first songs that really drew me in that direction. And around that time, I was probably a little younger. I would go to it was either my elementary school or it was 1, 2, first, second, and third grade, or the 4th, 5th, and 6th grade. We went to like the school was holding on a Friday night or something, like a garage sale in the gym, and we went there. And one of the 45s I got, I think, is NGM Records. The one side was the Cal Sills Indian Lake, and then the other side was Everybody's Somebody's Fool. And I'm trying to remember who that's by. Is that Connie Stevens? I want to say it's Connie Stevens, but I don't think that's right. But so that was an introduction. I liked Indian Lake. I liked Everybody's Somebody's Fool, but I didn't. It wasn't so that I found that I was that drawn to those songs. I didn't feel like, oh, I got to find out more about these groups or this person or anything like that. But it was Kiss. So I was getting little smatterings and little things of oldies music. And it's when we moved, my dad, IBM job, transferred him from Endicott, New York. And that's, by the way, Steve Kalinich is also from Endicott. So that's for those Beach Boy fans out there, although we didn't know each other or meet until years later. But we moved down in January of '79 to the Carolinas here. And once we got down here, I want to say it was February of '79. Then my parents went out, and it was just my younger brother and I. And just by chance, I happened to have the TV on, and Dead Man's Curve came on. The story about Jan and Dean. And I watched it, and I thought it was really cool and fun and interesting. Now the second part of it, which is like where he has his accident and then he's recovering, that kind of is like a heartwarming part of the story. But the first part of the story, where they're becoming these guys who sing in a garage, then they go from the garage to the recording studio. There's a scene in that. So it's an average TV movie, as many TV movies about celebrities are. They're not as good as if they went to a motion picture and ended up in a movie theater. Yeah, sure. It's just different budgets, and that's why you get what you get. But there's a scene where Richard Hatch and Bruce Davidson are standing next to each other with surfboards at the ocean. And he's, as Richard looks over at Bruce and says, this would sound so good on tape. And he's like, what? I said, this said so good on tape. And he's referring to the surf, the sound of the ocean. But they cut from that scene right into the studio. All of a sudden they're in the studio and they're singing Surfing. Surfing is the only life, and it's just that edit, that cut. And as soon as I saw that scene, I went, I gotta get this music. Wait, where do I find this music? Now, gratefully and thankfully, at that time in my life, 79, 80, you could go, you didn't have to go very far in a car to go to a used record shop or a record store or anything. And it was pretty easy to find things, and they were everywhere in the Charlotte market. So I went within, I don't know what the time frame was because I'd misremember it, but it wasn't long before I went and purchased the Jan and Dean Anthology album, which is kind of like Kiss Alive 2, but in a reversed way. Yeah. So that is a 2-record set. And so Jan and Dean's hits are on sides 1, 2, and 3. And then the 4th side of the Anthology album is this weird mashed up machine guns, cows mooing, cars crashing, burps. I I can't even think what else. Just whatever you can throw, a cacophony of sound effects thrown in with Jan and Dean performing live music. So I'm like, what is this? And I think around that time I was 14 or so. And for a 14-year-old kid, boy, I can't imagine a 14-year-old girl enjoying it.
Yeah.
But for me, I just thought it was hysterical because I didn't understand it. And I just thought it was so odd. I liked odd, and I still do. So at the same time, I was getting into Steve Martin, because Steve Martin used to be a fantastic stand-up comedian in the late 70s, early 80s. I mean, the world was his oyster. And he was a clean stand-up comedian, and he was always the butt of his own jokes, which is unique because there's very few comedians that ever have been able to execute successfully that type of stand-up. And he'd do his Let's Get Small was his first album, Wild and Crazy Guy, which he actually took that. And then on Saturday Night Live, if anybody's out there, you can go on Peacock. If you got streaming service to Peacock, you can watch all the old Saturday Night Lives. And you can see Steve Martin way back in the day do his opening routine. He'd do Wild and Crazy Guy. And he even did a skit with Dan Aykroyd called Wild and Crazy Guy. So the two of them would do their whole shaking thing, and they would be from, I don't know, Yugoslavia or something. I don't know. It was ridiculous. But Steve Martin albums. So I start getting Steve Martin albums. And there's one day that I remember very vividly. I was sitting in my room, and I'm going to put on the Steve Martin album. So I pull out the sleeve, and I'm getting the record on, and I put the record on, and I'm looking at the sleeve that came out, and it says graphic design by Dino Torrance. And I went, there's just absolutely no way that's the same guy. There's no way. and then I go to my Anthology album, and I notice the Anthology album was designed by Dean O. There's the O, right? Yeah. It's not Dean Torrance, it's Dean O. Torrance. And I went, son of a gun. Huh? And so that was one of my early lessons of being more than just one thing. Yeah. Right? If you can do one thing, great. Well, don't let that limit. Always ask yourself, what more can I do with what I'm doing? And so, and then of course, when Dead Man's Curve came out, there's a little bit of in that TV movie where you see that Dean is into graphics, but you don't see it enough. You don't understand that he went to USC, got a degree, and then went on to design albums he designed the Chicago Transit Authority logo before they became Chicago. He designed that. In-N-Out Burger, the American Music Awards logo. I want to say the Roxy. I think he did that. The Nitty Gritty Dirt Band. He designed a number of their albums. He designed, we lost one of the Monkees recently, Michael Nesmith. Yeah. Dean designed a number of Mike Nesmith's albums. So and Linda Ronstadt. I mean, it's just, since we're talking about the Beach Boys' most iconic logo, the neon, that's Dean's work. And so you look at that and it's like, well, son of a gun. I mean, that's what people don't understand. I'm going to go off on a quick aside here. What people don't understand about Jan and Dean they were in the music industry, but both of them had a scholastic background. Jan was studying to be a medical doctor. Dean was studying to be a graphic designer / architect, whatever that umbrella. And so Jan was going to UCLA. Dean was going to USC. They were both doing quite well. And Dean never took his eye off of education, ever. It didn't matter what they were doing as a Jan and Dean act. He never took his eye off what he was doing for a degree. And when I understood all that, I was amazed by it, because Jan and Dean would go to the record label, and the record label, Liberty Records, would say to them, you have to do this, this, and this. And they go, no, we don't. And they'd say, yes, you do. And they'd say, no, we don't. They say, well, what do you mean? You're on a contract. You say, well, you can do whatever you want with that contract. We don't care. Because I'm going to USC and he's going to UCLA. So we don't care. See, and that's why Jan and Dean never had a Christmas album. Okay, this is another fun. They did record one Christmas song, Frosty the Snowman. The reason they never did a Christmas album is because artists would record their Christmas albums during the summer. Okay. Well, Jan and Dean would go to college. They'd get out of college, and during the summer, they would tour as Jan and Dean.
Okay.
That was when they would do their appearances and record their other, they would record their albums in between courses during the college year.
Okay.
So whether it's the Little Old Lady from Pasadena album or the Dead Man's Curve album, whatever it was, or the Drag City album, they would do that while sporadically during the college years. So they were always kind of on the go, always creating music. And Jan was the creative force behind that. And Dean saw that Jan was the producer, the creative force, and thought, well, what can I do behind the scenes other than appearing in the pictures and singing on the songs? What can my contribution be? So that's why he started down this avenue of art, because he pictured and envisioned that he could be the designer for Jan and Dean, while Jan would be the music maker for Jan and Dean. So that is kind of the direction they were going. And when Jan had his accident, Dean had created a Jan and Dean label. They had their own label. They wanted out of their contract with Liberty, and I know I'm getting off on a side here, but the reason the Anthology album turned out to be so great for me, because I told you side 4 is so confusing, I didn't have any idea what it was. Years later, after probably 20 years, that's not an exaggeration, 20 years of me nudging Dean and picking on Dean and reminding Dean how great it would be. See, side 4 is actually an abridged, condensed version of this show they did that they actually handed over to Liberty Records to dissolve their contract. So they purposely, in '65, they released a live album called Command Performance. And I love it. That's one of my favorite Jan and Dean albums. And a year later, the record label says, we want another live album. And Jan and Dean are like, well, why would we do that? We just did that. We don't want to do that again. They said, we want you to do that. So they went to the Hullabaloo nightclub, did 2 shows. And during the show, one of the shows, somebody coughed and said, Jan said, bless you, or do you need an analgesic or something like that? and so what happens is they then decided, okay, this is what we're gonna do. We're gonna put these Hullabaloo shows together and let's go get all these sound effects and just slam them into this. And we're gonna turn that into the record label and say, see you later. Knowing that the record label is gonna not want to release it.
Yeah.
So they purposely sabotaged their own shows, went into the record label, and it actually says, I don't want to make this an R rating, but the writing on the acid tape is not clean. And it was fill in the blank. And instead of fillet of soul, it was fillet of, and that's what it wrote. That actually said that on the label that they handed to the record executives. And so they sat in the room with the record executives. They listened and they're like, what is this? We can't release this. And then Jan had his accident. And then, so if anyone watching this actually has a Jan and Dean Fillet of Soul album that was released by Liberty Records back in the 60s, that is kind of like a Frankenstein version of what Jan and Dean turned into them, and not what Jan and Dean envisioned for that release. And one of the great, most rewarding, valuable things I was able to do with Dean in 2017 was talk him into releasing that in its full entirety, the original Fillet of Soul show, with all that silly stuff on it. And it was released by Omnivore Recordings in September 2017 and is available now on Amazon. So if you like weird, funky, doesn't make any sense humor mixed with songs, then this album's for you. But for me as a kid who got it when I was 14 or whatever, it was a big deal to help kind of finally get that out there after all those years and to have Dean be on board with it.
I want to ask you this, because I've asked, when I had Bobby Figueroa on and Gary on and people such as that, I asked them, whether it's sports as well, that, when you're good at something, from a young age, this is what I'm going to do, and this is what's going to be in my life. And they sort of talked about it. But for you, was there, when you were younger around this period of time, was there any sort of concept that you had that this would be where you are today? Or is it something that struggled up through school that happened?
I think the one defining word and reality for me has just been music.
Yeah.
Although it's been quite a while in the last couple of years because of the pandemic, I normally would be in my church choir. I love that. I miss that. there's music is everything to me. It's like a life force, literally. And with I can't imagine a world without music. I
Yeah.
can't imagine, because it's expression. It's another
Yeah.
form of expression. It's another form of creativity. So that's one of the things that's so great for me is I will put on music while I work, and it ends up, it's kind of a conduit for what
Yeah. Sure.
it help. And I may not even be listening to what I'm working on. Like sometimes, most time, like if I'm doing the Sunflower issue of ESQ, where I'll put on the Sunflower album and I'll listen to that album, and that then I can kind of take what I'm hearing and kind of use it for my editor's notes or something like that, and the feel and the warmth of the music, and kind of have that guide my hand in terms of the layout and what I'm trying to communicate. But other times I'll just put on music that, like when I worked on the Carl issue, I had some Christmas music on, and you know it's just what, again, music, man, music is just a life force. And the beautiful thing for me about and I said it in the Carl issue about Carl, was that I don't think he's gone.
Yeah.
It's so unique when we have people who actually, for a living, what they do, that we get to meet them, or whatever. But there's so many walks of life. Whatever you do, if you're leaving a print behind, some sort of carbon print, that you're that even if you're not on Earth anymore and you've moved on, that people can still experience you and your intention and your purpose and your gift and what you left. What so that if that occurs, that's living, that's still present. And the fact that we can put on a Carl Wilson album or a Beach Boys album and experience Carl, that is living. And that's what I think is astonishing about music. And I don't think it's a value in the music uh, that I think people just take for granted, because music is just so easy to listen to.
Sure.
But if you're present with what you're experiencing, to be able to let it wash over you every time, and that doesn't always happen with me. But if I listen to Pet Sounds, and I can't tell you how many times I've heard it, but it's still, you know, I'm present with it,
Of course.
and it makes it, it just is enriching. And I can't imagine. I can't imagine. I mean, you look over here, you see I got White Album box set. I mean, you look over, I mean, this is, can't really tell, but there's all sorts of, this is my wall of CDs over here.
Okay.
That's every group you can imagine. So I'm a big Beatle nut too. I see you got that Beatle
I have.
picture behind you.
It was my aunt's, because she's a big I don't want to say scavenger, but going to yard sales and that stuff, and she found it, and it's a little crooked. I haven't yet found a Beach Boys poster that is on Amazon that I can get prime shipping with, that is of a standard that I want. So I'm still looking for that. But I wanted to mention, you talk about music and being a life force in that sort of area and relating to it, and I'm sure that's how you can connect and be on the same sort of page in a sense with Carl and Brian and those people who share the same sentiment. And you mentioned in the Carl issue about not just him saying the song from Summer in Paradise. He sings I don't want to butcher the Hawaii song.
Yeah, Alaya Aloha.
Yeah,
It's, I wanna, but I
Yeah.
can't stay.
You mentioned that, and you also mentioned when you talked to Carl's son, I think it was Justin, where you talk about the interview he had for, it must have been Endless Harmony, the movie, where he talks about making each other crazy. In the same interview, he mentions about how music is sort of a life force and it's a living being. And I'm sure, like I mentioned, that you sort of relate to them in that sense. I'm sure that's what makes Brian, I'm sure, and Mike and the other guys feel at ease with you.
That's I well, what puts them at ease with me, I'm grateful for. Whatever that is, whether it's telling jokes before, because that hasn't happened in a while. I mean, that's just how I allowed myself they allowed me into their world, and that's kind of how I wanted them to kind of know me, to kind of relax, so that it's relaxing.
Yeah.
It's hard for me to speculate on how they feel about me or what they think of me. I can just tell you they're great.
Oh yeah, I'm sure.
They're kind souls. All of them are kind souls, and they're just like, and in other ways, that's the thing about them. They're human,
Yeah.
right? And if you look at them as humans, which is, why would you look at them any other way? Yeah, granted, they've created this catalog of amazing songs and whatnot. But yes, that's who they are. They've done that.
But there's more
But
than that.
but I'll use a cliche term. They put their pants on one leg at a time. They don't just. There's not some magical force that they're just suddenly dressed. I mean, they're not above life, or they're not godly. They're not, and so that's the thing that I do see. That's kind of at times, not anymore, but when I was younger and do it, and I don't know when, but I just thought it was always unusual that when people talk about Brian, they kind of at times, oh my God, he's a god and stuff like that. And I think, gosh, I hope they don't mean that literally.
Yeah.
Because that's a thing that people can get into where they lose touch with reality.
Sure.
Granted, Brian Wilson, make no bones about it. There's no one who does vocal arrangements like he does. There's no one who wrote and created music the way that he did. And which is why Pet Sounds became like a bottle of wine. I think Al calls it like that, because years later we're still appreciating it. So the longer it's around, the more we appreciate it. So I can't imagine in the year 3000 what Pet Sounds will be. I mean, my God, it'll still be this thing. And imagine this: in the year 3000, Pet Sounds will be like Mozart, right?
Yeah.
Right? I mean, because it'll be that old. 1966 in the year 3000 is going to be ancient. Yeah. So just think about it. I completely agree with the fact that Brian is a modern day. He is a living, still with us. He is absolutely, I think, our generation's Mozart or Beethoven, Wagner, you name it.
Yeah.
He's that guy. But does that make him godly? I don't think so. So I always kind of, when I see people do that, or I see people say hurtful things towards other members, that equally for me is hard to look at and think, gosh, I really hope they don't mean that.
Yeah.
Because this is the type, again, these are human beings. They have feelings, and you can't, well, each of them is important to me, and each of them, and I never met Dennis. I had the good fortune to meet Carl. And he lives within me today. They are all good, solid people. Not everyone who meets them has that experience.
Sure.
I am very honored and lucky to have that experience. And I mentioned at the beginning that I had gone through some health issues, and it was Mike Love who spoke to me on the phone and said, hey, so I understand you're having a surgery. I want to give you a stomach exercise to do. It will help you. Unsolicited.
Yeah.
So these are people who care. And that's my experience. And, but they're all caring in their own unique way. Definitely. And I won't say anything to Beach Boy fans. This is something I want to communicate. Brian loves Mike.
Definitely.
And Mike loves Brian. That's an unconditional love. It's unconditional. I've been around both of those guys enough, and it's really unique. When I'm with Brian, there was a time when I was backstage with Brian, I guess in the catering room or whatever it was, a few years ago, and I felt Mike's presence, which was really weird to me, because it was not the Beach Boys tour. It was Brian, right? Mike wasn't there, and I felt Mike's presence, and it was weird. Not that anybody else felt it. I didn't talk about it out loud or anything like that, but I felt it. And I was, after that, because I became aware of that experience, I was with Mike at a show backstage somewhere, and I didn't feel the same way. I didn't feel Brian's presence. But when Mike took the stage and began to perform the songs is when I felt Brian's presence. When I looked out and saw Mike on stage performing that catalog, Brian's presence was there. And I think that when I experienced that, I think it was around 2015, 2016, when I experienced that, I went, son of a gun. There is something that's just is unavoidably beautiful about that. And that to me is the story of the Wilson and Love dynamic, is that no matter what, doesn't matter my perspective, doesn't matter any fan's perspective, those two will always be emotionally attached, and have a love for one another that I don't think any of us will ever quite understand. It's if you think you understand that they truly love each other,
There's
yes,
more.
but there's a lot more there, and they've been through so much, and um, that's I guess where I'll leave that. It's there's a lot of deep,
Sure,
passionate
definitely.
love there with a great value.
I want to also talk about, your beginning with ESQ. You joined, like you mentioned in 93. And at that period for both the Beach Boys, but also Jan and Dean, they had been around for 3 decades or a little bit more to that. When you joined that magazine at the time, it had been around for a little bit beforehand, as I did after doing my research. When you joined, how much of that moment when you first started was, well, we'll see how this goes, but who knows what happens? But also you wanted to make sure you're doing, I don't want to say a better job and, complain about that other people, but you wanted to change what happened and bring it up even higher up into the stratosphere.
Well, the first question I had with Lee Dempsey was, or the first conversation that we one of the first conversations a long time ago, was he asked me, "Do you want to do it with me?" Because I can't do it alone. They approached him because he had been writing for the other guys,
Okay.
and that was so they said, "Hey," and I'm not even paraphrasing here. I don't know how the conversation went with whoever contacted him and him with them, but the sense that I got was, hey, we're burnt out. We don't want to do this anymore. The Beach Boys won't give us the time of day. And if you take over this business license and do this, understand that the Beach Boys, it's not going to give you access to the Beach Boys. That's how it was kind of communicated to me.
Okay.
And I thought, okay, I don't care. I like the music. Right. So we went in with a very low subscription base. I think it was slightly over 200 people. Lee bought the business license so we could get up and running, set up a Charlotte post office box for it. And Lee's got a great business background, so he kind of knew those steps. I don't know at that point in my life if I would have been able to execute that. It was an easy assignment for me is, hey, do you want to write about the Beach Boys?
Yeah.
And I said, yeah, of course. Why not?
Exactly.
And the first interview I got to do was set up by a good friend of ours, Elliot Kendall, to talk to Dean. Wow. So my very first interview was with Dean Torrance, and I remember I was working in radio at the time, so I interviewed him from the radio station I was working at. But I remember being so nervous. I had that, that shaky voice, nervous. Yeah. When you're meeting somebody for the first time, will you sign my? Yeah. Get a picture. So it was that nervousness, and I don't know why, but he made me feel so at ease. Just the way and I think he was surprised by my knowledge, even then, about things of his career. I talked to him a lot about the TV pilot that he did with Jan back in the 60s called On the Run. And so that was kind of the beginning. And at that time, my role, and I don't remember how long we did it, but at that time we actually had to paste onto like, we had to take out the pages and paste them, glue them to flats. And then we had to give the flats to the printer, and then I guess they scanned them and then created the magazine that way. I'm not really sure. It wasn't on a printing press. It was very rudimentary stuff. We also talked about the look of the magazine. And the look of the magazine, I had met Lee a couple of years before, 93. So it was 90 or 91 that we met. We met at a record convention because by that time I was collecting Jan and Dean. I was trying to fill every gap that I had in my Jan and Dean collection. I started collecting Beach Boys. And by that time I had seen the 85 Malcolm Leo film, An American Band. and I was fascinated by the Smile stuff. I mean, anything Smile, I wanted to know more about. I thought, why did he record a song about fire? What was going on? How did? And by that time, I was like, how did they go from All Summer Long to Pet Sounds to Fire?
Yeah.
And I could not get it. I just was trying to wrap my mind around how did this happen in such a short span of time? Within 2 years, All Summer Long, Summer Days, Party, Barbara Ann, Pet Sounds, Good Vibrations, Heroes and Villains, Do You Like Worms?
Yeah.
And I just thought, how is this? What? This is the same group? So I was collecting records like a maniac at that point, picture sleeves, whatever I could get my hands on. And I met Lee at a record convention. And he was in front of me in the Beach Boys stuff. And I was very impatiently looking over his head, waiting for him to get out of the way I was concerned that he was going to buy something that I wanted.
Yeah,
so
definitely.
I was probably intruding upon his space. I was, doing the, like, come on, get out of the way, bub. But he turned around and we started talking and we became fast friends. And at the time I lived in Charlotte and he lived in Raleigh. It's about a few hour drive from one another. And he eventually moved to Charlotte and with his job transferred him here. And he said, hey, I live nearby. And at the time I was a morning show producer at the local oldie station. So we just struck up our friendship. And by that time, he said, so sometime after we met at the record convention, he said, hey, you ought to subscribe to this Endless Summer Quarterly. I write for it. And I did for 1 year. So between, I think, 91 to 92, again, before he moved to Charlotte, I subscribed and you get the 4 issues. And honestly, to this day, when I think back, I stopped after the year because I didn't think there was any value within it. And I hate to say it that way, but it was mostly pictures of maybe sheet music and pictures of the editors with their arms around the Beach Boys. And then the content inside, if Lee wrote an article, I read it. It was called Chuck's Rolling, in reference to the Beach Boys engineer, Chuck Britz. And it would be an article about a session. And that was interesting. And then Les Chan, God rest his soul, he did the news section. So, and again, there's no Google back then.
Yeah.
Anything that was in this magazine, news-wise, was interesting. But the rest of the magazines was just, I just felt like this isn't worth it. I just wasn't learning. I didn't feel like I was learning all that much. And so I stopped subscribing after a year. Then, a year later, Lee moves down to Charlotte. We get together. He gets contacted by them in summer of 93, and they say, we can't do this anymore. We're burnt out. And they started in 87. So that's a 5-year, right? No, it's 5 or 6 years they were doing it. And they just, for whatever reason, again, they had the conversation with him. They didn't want to do it anymore. The Beach Boys weren't acknowledging them or whatever. I don't know.
Yeah.
But so we took it over with that understanding. And I just thought, well, let's have fun with this. And we did. And I look back at the first issue we did. It's pretty goofy. We're standing there holding guitars. That was Lee's idea. I don't know what we were trying to do. But it just became within about, I don't know, it was in a short time. We got to meet them, of course. We were, and I think that was, the first show we went to, I'll tell you, so we started in August of 93. The first show I go to see with Lee, once we're doing the magazine, is the very first date of their 93 box set tour. Wow. And the very first show was in Charlotte. So I go to this show and they're playing cuts, deep cuts, Vegetables, Wonderful, Take a Load Off Your Feet. It's like an acoustic tour. And Carl Wilson, I want to say it's Vegetables to Wonderful. I think those were the song transitions. But so Carl's playing guitar and singing. He takes his guitar off and sits behind the keyboard and sings Wonderful. And I'm thinking, I've died and gone to heaven. Because Carl Wilson, I've never seen anything like this. And the other standout moment of that show for me, Billy was in, I think Billy was a part of it, I think so. Matt Jardine kind of coming out. To me, that was the Matt Jardine's coming out show to me, because he was taking all those high parts And it just struck me. I just thought, oh my gosh, I've just seen it. I can't get over this show. So that just getting into the magazine and seeing that show just ignited kind of a fire in me. Like, wow, I just couldn't believe it. And I just wanted to just kind of that inspiration was my motivation.
Yeah.
And fast forward a few more years, we get to February of '98 and Carl dies. And all I remember feeling and thinking at that time was, now I have to do this more than ever.
Of course.
Because Carl's gone. And I don't know if there's truth to that. I don't know if that's true. It's how I felt.
Yeah.
So I mean, I don't know if the Beach Boys would agree with that ideal or perception. But it's how I felt. And I felt that Dennis and Carl deserved, the Beach Boys themselves as a group deserved someone to be legitimately caring about who they are, who they were, and what they've done. And that's just kind of how I've approached it. So that goes back to me telling jokes when I had time with them, because putting them at ease, to help them tell their story, to tell their story in a way that it's beautiful and which matches the music, right?
Yeah.
There's lots of history that we've read about or know about that have to do with other things that are outside the making of the music. And while those things in some cases are more relevant than others, there's nothing that's going to change anything about on these albums. It's nothing that changes it. So the music is the resource for me. The people who made the music are the umbrella around the resource. So it's like understanding how to take care of a plant. If you don't water the plant's going to die. And if you don't treat the Beach Boys with the respect that they deserve for having changed the world musically, then I don't think I deserve their time, or anyone else for that matter. Yeah. If you're not willing to look at what they've done and categorically look at it as a family of music, created by a group of people who have earned our respect. I'm not about, again, I touched on this a little bit.
Yeah.
Again, Brian, yes, the foundation, but Carl Wilson, Dennis Wilson, Mike Love, Al Jardine, Bruce Johnston, Blondie Chaplin, Ricky Fattar, David Marks, all of them have contributed in a way that, if not for the contribution, we wouldn't have what we have today. So that's, I just found once, and I'll use this because it's how I felt. Once the wind in my sails kind of picked up when Carl left us, I just felt like a gust of support, like this, almost like a religious experience, like very strong emotional push to make, if I was going to do this magazine, then I was going to do it right.
Yeah. Now, you had mentioned now the music in the box and that tour that you saw them on. 93 when you start, and around that time they had released, in 89 they'd released Still Cruising, and then The Summer in Paradise, and a few other stuff in the box at 93, which sort of, I think, helped them get bigger again. How do you assess that music from that period of time? I mean, are you still a fan, or is it now just a professional appreciation of them?
What, the box set stuff, or like Summer in Paradise?
The music from that period when you started with Endless Summer Recording and into when you started to pick up more with it.
I've been accused of being easy to please by my family. So I think there's a sense that there's truth to that. I love music. As I said earlier, I love music. Yeah. And so, when Still Cruising came out, I can remember I had a cassette in my car and just loving Somewhere Near Japan, loving it because of the way that the voices marry, right? Yeah. You go back to Pet Sounds, and what did Brian do? Well, Brian had a bunch of musicians, the Wrecking Crew and others, jammed into Western, which was this kind of thin studio, the instruments would bleed over one another and create this bigger sound. Well, that's what the Beach Boys do vocally. And so when I would get to hear any song, I don't care what era it's from, when I hear those voices bleed over into one another, and one guy's voice trails off and then the other guy's voice comes in, it's all I need to be happy. So you go back to God Only Knows and that tale where Bruce and Carl and Brian are taking turns singing. That's
Yeah.
hands down, like, oh, how do you get over that? But you go all the way fast forward to somewhere near Japan, and there's these little moments, and that's what it's about for me, is moments. Like Carl sings, my engine's all burned out, my crew has all bailed out. And then Bruce comes in, somewhere near Japan. That's Al going, somewhere near Japan. And Mike goes, and she said, it's that. It's this like, I want to see that live. I want to experience that. I want to be there for that. That's just a great moment for me. And the 85 album, which if you talk to a lot of people who grew up on the Beach Boys in the beginning, the 85 album is like,
Yeah.
Or the Summer in Paradise album. Oh God, Brian's not even on it. Oh God. And I'm sorry, I enjoy them. Yes. I enjoy them, but I'm not sorry. I'm not sorry because I turn on that 85 album. I can remember because I was just going into broadcast school, and then when that album came out, and then going into my first radio job, I just remember driving and having that cassette in my car and just singing along to get you back. Any song, because Carl just comes through like a powerhouse on that album, and Brian sounds great, and I know, and I get it now. Again, because I like pop music, I like Culture Club, so for me to discover that the guy who produced that album was the guy who did Culture Club, I was fine with it. I don't get upset because somebody comes in, or if I put on an album that's a new Beach Boy album that I'll give you an example. Nashville Sounds, the Stars and Stripes thing, right? I got to go down to Nashville and be a part of Fanfare. I was backstage with all of them. All of them were there. And all the country stars were there. It was fascinating. But then, you get the album and it's kind of like, really?
Yeah.
They could not have. So, and to this day, this is how I feel for that album. They couldn't have like gone to these country artists and said, hey, Willie, we want to do one of your songs. Will you sing it with us? Yeah. And then gone to Rodney Crowell and said, hey, Rodney, we want to do one of your songs. Or here's one of our favorite old country songs. Will you sing it with us? As opposed to just doing Beach Boy songs again with country artists. I just thought that to this day, I'm just kind of a little flat with that. But there are still great moments on that record.
Yeah.
Willie Nelson, Warmth of the Sun. Oh, great recording. Kathy Tricoli singing I Can Hear Music, and hearing Carl in the background going, oh, oh, oh. Boom. For me, again, just the Carl, oh, 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 it's all I need. Yeah. So, but again, that album rates very low in terms of, do I listen to it often? No. Does it bring me joy when I hear it?
Yeah.
I don't know. It's got some nice moments. And Jimmy Webb and Timothy B. Schmidt on Caroline No is Jimmy. God, how do you get around that? I mean, those massive, talented people doing Beach Boy songs. I mean, so that if you look at it through that spectrum, it's, so I always try to look at everything through the spectrum of what do I appreciate about it, as opposed to what don't I like about it. So I don't really do the I don't like. I usually look at what do I like, what do I enjoy, and so and I can go album by album and pull an enjoyable moment. MIU, I can tell you, Winds of Change right off the bat is one of the most gorgeous, I think, overlooked songs by Al Jardine that people go, what? How does that go? And I say, you got to listen to it.
Yeah.
It's not something I can sing to you, even if I was a great singer, which I'm not. But even if it's you have to experience it. You have to put it on and experience it. And it's a great song. And their version of California Dreamin', I thought was fantastic. And that video I thought was fantastic. It's funny because I will say the cheese fell off the cracker when they did Wipeout. It just slid right off.
Yeah.
It's not, even if it was the strongest cheese made to man. It just still slid. And I look at that. And so there's been those moments, you know,
Yeah,
but
definitely.
Carl is not, all I can see when I saw that Carl was not involved, I went, okay,
Yes.
that told me all I needed to know,
Yes.
you know, because Carl was very specific about, by that time in their careers, Carl was pretty specific about what he was willing to do and not willing to do.
Okay. Yeah.
And Carl was very much into the integrity of what the group was doing and how to forward
Sure.
their musical paths and to create more than what they had created, do something beyond what they have done. And his love for rhythm and blues, I think that's why with the Beach Boys is such a diverse group. You know,
Yeah.
you listen to Wild Honey, it's a rhythm and blues album. And I'm probably, if Carl were alive today, he'd probably cite that album as being one of his favorites because he was such a major Aretha Franklin, Stevie Wonder. Gosh, who else was anybody rhythm and blues? He loved it. He loved it. As you learned in the Carl issue, he loved rhythm and blues, and so much so, you know, his major writing partner was Myrna Smith Schilling from the Sweet Inspirations. And I'll tell you, this is what I would recommend to anyone. I listened to Carl's 1981 self-titled solo album for a lot through the years.
Yeah.
And I'd always go back to it and I'd listen to it. And I wasn't making a deep connection with it. But in doing this recent issue and learning more about Myrna and Googling her and learning more about the Sweet Inspirations, and I recommend anybody do that, because if you go to Google the Sweet Inspirations and learn who was in that group, it will astonish you, because there's some serious historical matriarch people in that family to other people who became very successful, famous singers. And that's all I'm going to do, because I want people to discover it themselves. So when I discovered who she was, not just somebody who was in Elvis's group and sang backup for him, but understood who she was and understood her background and understood she was the lyricist for Carl's records, I went back and listened to his self-titled album again and had such a much deeper appreciation for it and got it and connected with it. And that's what I think is one of those things that people have to do, is they have to, if you really, well, no, they don't have to do anything. If anybody who's watching this, I'm hopeful that they're music fans, first of all, and that they would just allow the music to wash over them and appreciate it and experience it. And that, I think, is difficult for a lot of people to do if they say, oh, I don't like this specific album. I don't want to listen to this specific album. I don't like it. Let's say Summer in Paradise. Brian's not on it. Why would I listen to it? And Summer in Paradise does have a bit of a problem with it. And that is Terry Melcher, rest his soul, had discovered Pro Tools. And it was really, Summer in Paradise is one of the first albums in the rock industry that used Pro Tools.
Yeah.
You go back and look, it was like the first album that was done on. So it's historically significant for that purpose. And what happened was, because they discovered Pro Tools, when they were using Pro Tools, they ended up relying on electronics,
Okay.
right? So the drums became synthesized, and a lot of the instrumentation became synthesized, and some of the vocals became synthesized. And that's something you really want to do to a Beach Boys album.
Yeah.
They should have had a real drummer. They should have had, Jim Keltner, who everybody knows that name. He was basically the fifth Wilbury.
Yes.
Jim Keltner does the drums on Kokomo. Okay. So, but they were sampled sounds. Jim Keltner came up with the sounds that you hear on Kokomo by going into his kitchen and salt shakers and all that stuff. So Van Dyke Parks plays on Kokomo. Okay. Ry Cooder plays the guitar on Kokomo. Okay, so you got Jim Keltner, Ry Cooder, Van Dyke Parks on Kokomo.
Yeah.
And people dismiss Kokomo like it's nothing. No, It's not nothing. It's, when you understand who is on that song, it's like, holy crap, And then you take into account that it was produced by the guy who used to produce the Byrds, Terry Melcher.
Yeah.
And you take into account that it was it started off being written by Scott McKenzie, the guy who wrote If You're Going to San Francisco, Wear Some Flowers in Your Hair, and John Hunter Phillips of the Mamas and Papas. You got right there with just Melcher, McKenzie, and Phillips, great historical
Yes.
1960s legacy right there. You had Ry Cooder, Van Dyke Parks, and Jim Keltner. It's like, well, wait a minute. Why is this song so passe or tossed away by Beach Boy fans as this unimportant recording? It's not unimportant. It's historical. And granted, it's just pop friendly fare, right?
Yeah.
It's just a pop, it's just a great, everybody knows it. You know it, I know it, your grandma knows it, grandma's knows, and great grandparents know it. It's just one of those great songs. And it's a testament to, I would say, in reference to Mike Love here, it's a testament to Mike's ability to recognize with Terry potential.
Yes.
And be able to extrapolate the potential and execute it. And that's really Terry's execution. But that's a special team up right there. They did some great stuff together. And the Summer in Paradise album has some really interesting special moments for me.
Yes.
Lahaina Aloha is one of them. Strange Things Happen is another. I like it. I just like it. She believes in God. Yeah, she believes in God. It's just the delivery. It's the execution of the song. But then there's other moments you hear, remember walking in the sand, and then back down there is this, remember. And it's like, oh, does that, we don't need to hear an electronic vocal going, remember. And so it hurts the song.
Yeah.
It hurts the recording. And so when you I get it for anybody who's listened to that song or that album and said, yeah, I get it, because unfortunately, in the advent of Pro Tools and the execution of Pro Tools on a Beach Boys album, that album, I think, would be so much better today.
Exactly.
If it had been real musicians, just all background vocals by actual people, and got rid of that synthesized muck.
Yeah.
I'll call it. But at the same time, it's historical because it was being discovered at the time. And Terry Melcher was the producer, being the producer he was ahead of his time.
Yeah.
Right. But it hurt because it's a Beach Boys record.
Yeah.
So, you just take, but again, you have to look at the information as a part of your conclusion to what you're listening to. But again, there's songs on there that I enjoy listening to. The One Summer Night, Bruce's song, and how it segues into Al. I like it. Again, anytime I get to hear those voices.
Yeah.
And Al's got such a great voice to this day.
Of course, yes.
Yeah.
The two-time